emotions and their what we call the fight or flight mechanism in the body, which is our emergency response to danger. And oftentimes, stress is interpreted as physical danger, and it kicks in what's called fight or flight. And what fight or flight is a system in the body that is in many ways controlled by the pituitary, but it triggers the adrenal to release hormones that get our body ready for danger. And part of that response is an inflammatory response in case there's an injury. So your body gets ready to clot your blood, your adrenals put out adrenaline. There's another hormone called cortisol, which is a natural anti-inflammatory that's put out by the adrenal glands. And various functions happen. The blood shuts down to the digestive system, gets channeled into the muscles more. So basically, this fight or flight response is a automatic response to a stressful situation, and sometimes that stress could be emotional stress. It could be stress at work or at home, and even though the response could be one of life and death in terms of the way your body responds, there may not actually be any physical danger. And a lot of times, the stresses that we're under are not actual life and death situations, but our body still tends to interpret that. It will kick in this immune response along with all the hormones that are associated with it. And if that becomes chronic, that can also trigger what we call a chronic inflammatory response. And there's certain symptoms of that, most notably stiffness, swelling, um, joints being swollen. Eventually, the immune system can get depressed by running all the time. The white blood cell count can start to drop. Cortisol levels can spike, and that's certainly one way to test for that. And then eventually, the adrenal glands, which put out these adrenal hormones to get your body ready for this emergency, can start to get depleted. And then we end up with a problem called hypoadrenia, where the adrenals become weak, and then we start to get symptoms of a lowered immune response, more susceptibility to infection, dizziness when we get up, what's called hypotension or postural hypotension, sensitivity to bright light. There's a lot of symptoms, and we could actually do a whole show on what's called hypoadrenia or depletion of the adrenal glands. Other things that can cause inflammation, and probably one that occurs more often nowadays with all the GMO foods and foods that trigger an antibody response, would be food sensitivities. Certainly, people are aware of people that are sensitive to gluten, wheat, dairy are probably the more common ones. Peanuts, peanut allergies are common as well, where a person has what's called a anaphylactic reaction to a food. And food sensitivities can quickly or even gradually or even on a chronic level trigger a inflammatory immune response. Crohn's disease is another example of that. So to have ways of being able to know what your food sensitivities are is important, particularly if you're having abdominal pain and symptoms of leaky gut. That could indicate that there's a food sensitivity going on. And I think certainly with foods that are getting more and more altered, the tendency towards this, what we call an inflammatory gut syndrome or leaky gut, is going to become more and more prevalent. So we talked about trauma, we talked about stress, infection, joint wear and misalignments in your spine and the joints can also cause inflammation just from the irritation. I mean, we know of people, or maybe even folks out there that are listening to the show may have knee joints or ankle joints or lower back pain that's caused by the cartilage being worn, which is the surface between the joints that keep them, from rubbing against one another. This cartilage surface that comes between the joints can get worn due to the aging process, and also due to misalignments in the joint and being extra hard on the joints, depending on what you're your work is, carpenters and people that do repetitive work are more prone to these things. And those joints can wear. And when the joints wear, that can also trigger an immune response. The joints can swell, they become painful, they become achy. So that can cause inflammation. Um, and even the aging process itself, what we call the oxidative aging process, where the tissue begins to age, process of wear and tear can trigger this immune response, causing stiffness. In more extreme cases, can make it so a person can't even move. So there's a lot of different reasons that inflammation can occur in the body, and the signs and symptoms of these need to be watched. Now, from a Western medical point of view, often this is treated with what are called anti-inflammatories, and there's really two major groups. I mean, there are other ones, but the two major groups of anti-inflammatories that are treated in the medical field are steroidal and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. And these are drugs that basically work to help control and deal with inflammation. The non-steroidal drugs are ones that don't have steroids in them, which the steroids are ones that mimic what the adrenal gland does in terms of producing cortisol. The non-steroidal drugs function by reducing the production of what are called prostaglandins in the body, which are chemicals that actually promote the inflammatory response. So the non-steroidal drugs, through blocking certain enzymes, will actually reduce the levels of prostaglandins in the body, which are naturally produced to start this inflammatory process. So when we're giving somebody, or when a medical doctor gives somebody a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, they're actually trying to dampen down this inflammatory response, not necessarily dealing with what I would call the cause factor. So if it's a food that's triggering this sensitivity, or if it's an infection, or there's something else, then it may not necessarily be getting at what the cause of the infection is. And then we've got our steroidal anti-inflammatories, which include the prednisone and the corticosteroids, which are very similar to the corticosteroids that are produced by the adrenal glands. And these suppress inflammation more on a cellular level. They actually work on a cellular level by turning on and turning off genes that control the inflammatory process. Inflammation is actually controlled on a genetic level by our DNA. It's programmed into our DNA, and certain parts of our DNA, our genes, actually turn on to start this inflammatory process going. It's a natural response, which happens due to some sort of insult, as we already had talked about. And steroids basically turn that off. You have natural occurring steroids in your body, your mineral corticosteroids, which are produced by your adrenal glands, which help to control this as well. But again, they can become depleted over time, and this inflammatory process can really take off, kind of like a fire. I often talk to people about inflammation being like a fire. If it's been going for a while, particularly if a person's doing a lot of refined foods, refined carbohydrates and sugars, that will often feed this fire, what we call an inflammatory fire, and it'll really accelerate it. And then before you know it, it's turned into a systemic inflammatory response. So those are the drugs that treat this. And in just a few minutes, we'll talk about some of the natural approaches to inflammation. But before I do that, there are a couple blood tests that can also predict the level and sort of gauge how much inflammation is going on in the body. Keeping in mind that these are very non-specific blood tests, but one of them is called a erythrocyte sedimentation rate, or a SED rate. And what a SED rate is it's a measurement of how long it takes for the red blood cells to come out of solution, to kind of settle. And I mean, it's done, through machines now, but it used to be that they'd actually observe the blood after blood's taken in time, how quickly the red blood cells take to settle out. And what's happening on a cellular level is that when there's inflammation in the body, the red blood cells become very sticky. They actually start to stick together and they form chains, which we call rouleaux, which are like this, it's like stacked coins. If you look at them under the microscope, you'll see the red blood cells are all stacked together, and that makes them heavier, so they tend to fall out of solution. So a sed rate is a very non-specific way of gauging how much inflammation there is. So the more inflamed the body is, the higher the sed rate is. So if someone's got a very high sed rate, that's an indication they've got inflammation. The problem with having a sed rate done is that it doesn't really tell you why the sed rate is high. It just says that we've got inflammation. It's kind of like the check engine light on your car saying, this says check inflammation, but it doesn't tell you why. I mean, it could be from infection. It could be from rheumatoid arthritis or some sort of rheumatic disease. It could be from a lot of different sources. Cancer causing an inflammatory immune response could cause a high sed rate. So it doesn't really give you a specific diagnosis. It just says body's inflamed and we need to look at it. The other one's called a C-reactive protein, and that's another test for, it's more of a test for how much inflammation there is in the arteries. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, and I believe this is the direction that heart disease is going to go in, and certainly diabetes and a lot of other diseases, it should be looked at more as an inflammatory disease, that we've got inflammation going on. So C-reactive protein gives you an idea of how much inflammation we have in the vascular system. And again, that could be an indication that if the arteries and blood vessels are getting inflamed, that certainly could lead to a much higher chance of plaque and deposits forming in that cardiovascular system, thus causing plaque formation and arteriosclerosis, and ultimately heart disease, blockages in the coronary arteries, which are the arteries that feed the heart. So those are two very non-specific tests for inflammation that you can have done. And certainly symptom-wise, inflammation can also be gauged by generally how your body feels, and how you feel, when you're moving around, and whether your joints are swelling, and whether you have abdominal pain. And a lot of these symptoms can come on very subtly in the beginning. And it's my feeling that if we don't pay attention to the smaller symptoms, then those can continue to escalate, particularly if we're just suppressing the symptoms with medication rather than trying to figure out what it is that's causing it. Trying to get to the bottom of causation in terms of symptoms, I think, is very important, because the body does not just generate these symptoms out of the blue. And we've become a very, what I call a symptom-based society in terms of the way that we care for our symptoms. If somebody has pain, oftentimes they take a painkiller. If they've got inflammation, they take an anti-inflammatory. Whatever the symptom is, headaches, rather than trying to figure out, well, what may be causing this? What's going on here? Is there a joint misaligned? Is there a food sensitivity going on? What is inflaming the body? And I think it's important that that's paid attention to, or else the symptoms can start to accelerate, or the inflammatory response can start to cause the immune system to start to get run down, and then we become more susceptible to infection, viruses. And we need to keep in mind too, this immune system is what is controlling the development of unhealthy cells in our body. Cells, out of all the 10 trillion or whatever, huge amount of cells we have in our body, we're going to have a certain amount of those that are genetically not going to be healthy. And our immune system can recognize that in a healthy body and can kill those cells, and so before they have a chance to start replicating. The whole process of cancer on a very general level is cells in the body that are reproducing at a fairly high rate that don't really have any useful function. And typically a healthy immune system is able to identify these as unhealthy cells. And the macrophages and your neutrophils and your white blood cells are able to, once the antibodies recognize these and identify them, they're able to leave the bloodstream and take care of them. And this process is going on all the time. I mean, we wouldn't survive more than a very short period of time without having that immune system functioning. But again, long-term stress on the adrenal glands and with an inflammatory response can deplete that immune system, and at least theoretically lead to possibly development of different cancers. Well, it looks like we are starting to run out of time here. This is such a large subject to talk about. I think the next show that we're going to do on inflammation, we'll start talking about the foods that help and foods that tend to feed inflammation, and particularly talk about turmeric, which is a great herb for dealing with inflammation. Our next show next week will be with Ellie Daniels, talking about midwifery and her long career as being a midwife. And it was so nice to have you here on Health Thyself, and hope you enjoyed the show. So from Dr. Mike, we'll see you again soon. Bless you.